So I want to focus on Eric Holder, our current Attorney General, because there's a lot of blame that can be thrown at this current administration and why they weren't more tough with the banks. And so you go back to actually a memo.
The Holder memo.
The Holder memo that he wrote in the 90s, and there's something called collateral consequences. And so here's just a little excerpt of what Holder had written at the time. It says, one of the factors in determining whether to charge a natural person or a corporation is whether the likely punishment is appropriate given the nature and seriousness of the crime. In the corporate context, prosecutors may take into account the possibly substantial consequences to a corporation's officers, directors, employees, and shareholders. Tell us how that line ended up changing so much.
Well, so all he was really saying with this line was if you're targeting a big company for an investigation and you're worried that criminally prosecuting the company might result in lots of innocent people suffering, like the shareholders or maybe executives who had no part in the wrongdoing, or maybe even just the community where the company exists, you may seek other remedies. In other words, you might seek fines or non-prosecution agreements or deferred prosecution agreements. This makes sense in a vacuum. You know, if you have a venerable 100 or 150-year-old company and some group of executives does something terrible, it may not make sense to destroy the company with a criminal charge, which often happens. Look what happened to Arthur Andersen. They filed a single charge after the Enron case against that accounting firm, and the company went up in flames and 27,000 jobs were lost, and that's a terrible thing. You know, we understand that. But what they've done now is they've begun to conflate collateral consequences with this new policy where not only do they not charge the companies, but they don't charge any individuals at the companies either. And collateral consequences is now more or less the official law of the land, because we now live when he wrote that, that was before Too Big to Fail. Now we live in a society where that is dominated by these too big to fail companies.
But what does getting rid of an executive have to do with the entire firm being too big to fail?
That's exactly the point. There's no reason why we can't go into, let's say, HSBC, where they're laundering drug money for, you know, the Mexican drug cartels. Why can't we snatch up a bunch of executives from that company and toss them in jail? And you know, the excuse they gave after they levied a fine to HSBC of $1.9 billion, but gave everybody else a total walk, was that we just don't know what will happen. Like, you know, it's like the butterfly effect, basically. Like, if we prosecute this company, God knows what will happen to the rest of the economy around the world. So therefore, you know, let's not risk it. Lenny Brewer, the head of the criminal division, even talked about how worrying about the cost to innocent executives kept him up at night with worry. And what's so interesting about this is that nobody is thinking about the consequences of, again, let's say the single mom on welfare who loses her kids because of like some penny ante welfare fraud, which might even involve just accidentally checking the wrong box in a form. You know, there's this awful whole galaxy of consequences for people who get caught up in the system. If you get caught for welfare fraud, that might mean your grandmother will lose her Section 8 housing and will end up getting tossed out in the street. I mean, there's all kinds of things that happen to regular people. But the head of the criminal division of the Justice Department is worried about executives at big banks, and that's what's keeping him up at night. He's not up at night worrying about ordinary people, and that to me was just extraordinary.
But is this a symptom and a representation of this administration as a whole? You know, they came into town and kind of cleaned house, came with a whole new crew of young,
I think it's
Ivy League corporate favoring hotshots.
Look, this book is not kind to this current administration, but I don't think it's necessarily solely a reflection on the Obama administration. I think things have kind of been organically moving in this direction for a while now. If you go back to the SNL crisis, we put 800 people in jail after the SNL crisis. The next big round of scandals were the accounting scandals of the 2000s. And we put a few people in jail after that, mainly the top executives, but it wasn't the same kind of thing after the SNL crisis where we had a big roundup. And then, you know, a decade later, the subprime mortgage crisis, what's the number? And now it's 0, right? So there's been a progression, and it's not solely at the feet of the Obama administration. It's just that, again, there's just been this change in the way we look at dealing with this kind of crime. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that the people who are now in the regulatory structure or in the Justice Department A lot of them come from the corporate defense community. They don't have that prosecutorial Elliot Spitzer get your man at all costs mindset. These are deal makers. These are people who want to bring everybody in a room, come up with a settlement, and have everybody walk out happy. And that's just different from the way things used to be.
I'd love a woman to be president, but it's not just one president that will matter, even though that's a very important first step. One of the reasons I wrote Lean In is my 4-year-old daughter, when she was 4, learned the names of the presidents and looked up, and she was in a song. She said, "Mommy, why are they all boys?"